Well, Randy, you nailed it. I am talking about the power of God tonight because that fits in quite well with the particular parable that we're talking about. There's a quote that's attributed to Leonardo da Vinci where he supposedly said that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And I think that we can kind of relate to that, to put it in human terms. It's when somebody, they know some very technical and very expert topic, and they're able to put it in the simplest of human terms to where you and I can understand it. It'd be the equivalent of a rocket scientist who can point to every little bitty thing and explain what it does, and they really know their craft. And that's what a parable is in a nutshell. It's taking this sophisticated topic, God and the kingdom of heaven, and it's Jesus putting it in human terms. It's these great truths about God and his kingdom and everything that he wants for us, and it's putting it in these short and memorable stories in a way that we can relate to them and we can understand them and we can use them. And I think it's great that we're taking a little bit of time for the rest of this week to kind of explore these ideas. And as was mentioned, we're going to start with the parable of the mustard seed. And by extension, we're also going to be talking about the parable of the leaven, because you'll find that those two parables are always put in the same context, and I think that they complement each other. So the three texts that we'll kind of be looking at are Matthew 13, Mark 4, and Luke 13. Although we're going to spend the most time in Matthew chapter 13. So if you want to go ahead and turn there, it's Matthew chapter 13 and verse 31. And what I want to do this evening is simply take a look at these two simple stories. And what I want to do is boil them down to their simplest truths, to look at these sophisticated messages that Jesus puts as simple truths in these parables. Because I think sometimes another tendency that we're tempted to have with parables is attributing meaning where it doesn't exist. It's easy to look at all of the little details and say, okay, well, what does that mean? And then the other details, and well, what does this mean? And if you do that, you can create some pretty solid-sounding arguments, but when you look at them in the context, they're also some pretty fantastic and out there arguments. So all I want to do is look at the simple truths and see where that takes us and see how we can apply those. So Matthew chapter 13, starting in verse 31, it says, "He put another parable before them, saying, 'The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it is grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches.' He told them another parable. 'The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened.'" So what can we take from this? I want to try and draw out 3 things that I think we can really bring from this, and then I want to look at how we can apply those things. The first of which is that I think at its purest form, this is a message and is a testimony to the power of God. Isn't it interesting that Jesus would choose a mustard seed and leaven? What in particular is so special about those things? I mean, yes, they're small, but Jesus could have picked out any seed and said, this is a small seed, and then when it grows, it's this massive tree or this massive plant. Any seed in relation to the plant that it grows into is small. But regardless of why he picked what he picked, the point is that the potential of the seed is massive. Leaven, when you add it to dough, it's invisible. You don't sit there and watch, all of the reactions that are happening to the dough as it begins to grow and it forces it to grow. But the potential there is massive. And it's hard for us to kind of see small things like that as a testimony to the power of God, but it's what they are. God is not using a language of power here. He's not using a language of strength. He's not, outright coming forward and saying, the kingdom of God is going to be this massive tower that's impenetrable and will always stand. And because that's what we think. That's where our mind goes when we think about, heaven and God. We go to that strength. But what he is saying here is he's diminishing that picture to the smallest of things imaginable. And he's saying that's where that strength lies, is not in our perceptions of God as this enormous thing, but in this small thing that has the potential to continue to grow. And it will always have that potential to continue to grow because of God's strength. And I think that is kind of that is the first truth that Jesus is saying here, is that God is powerful, and that he will use his strength to his ends with the kingdom of heaven when that is finally realized. But besides that, I think that we also see a second truth in this, and especially in particular with the parable of the mustard seed, in that we will always have a place to come to because of the love of God. And you might be saying, okay, Ryan, well, where do you get that? Verse 32. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. I think that's pretty clear, that the seed isn't becoming a tree for some type of potential, return that the sower can get from it. It becomes a tree so that the birds of the air can come and make nests in its branches. And when you look at the motive, why would this person sow this seed if it's just for the birds of the air? It doesn't make any sense. And when you look at the kingdom of heaven and you wonder, why would God create that for human beings who just sin and run amok and go against his will repeatedly? It doesn't make any sense. Until, you throw into the equation God's love for us. John 3:16, it's a very, it's something that we repeat all the time because, it means a lot to us. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And that is the action that sparked, this chain reaction that is leading us onward and forward to the kingdom of heaven. So this isn't something that Jesus is saying here that he gets anything out of. He's saying that, the kingdom of heaven is like a place that grows and gives you a home. And it's not because of anything that you've done. It's something that you come to, and it's something that you attach yourself to, and something that God has produced out of love. And there's no other explanation that really makes sense when you look at it in that way. So, God is powerful, and God loves us. But I think that there is a third truth that we can kind of pull from these stories that really brings things home, so to speak. And it's that it's a story that encourages us to wait on the Lord. And I get that more so from the parables themselves, but also from the context of the parable. Not going to step on anyone else's lessons or anything like that, but there's two parables that precede these parables, where Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and he's kind of giving this as an explanation for why he teaches to them in parables. And those two parables are the parable of the sower and the parable of the weeds. And like I said, I'm not going to go into those, but just to kind of summarize, the flow of what's happening. The parable of the sower is a parable about the hearts of the people who hear the message of God. And there's all of these different hearts and all these different people who listen or don't listen. And then from there, Jesus jumps right into the next parable, which is the parable of the weeds. And it's this parable about an enemy that comes and sows, tares in a wheat field, and how judgment comes at the end of that parable when, the wheat is separated. And judgment comes against the enemy and the good and the bad fruit. And once you get through those two parables, which are a little bit larger and I think worthy of study in and of themselves, once you get past those two parables, you get to these two quick little stories about a mustard seed and some leaven, and how they grow. And you have to kind of step back and wonder, okay, Jesus is talking about the hearts of people. He's talking about an enemy and a coming judgment. And I think that it's when you kind of view it in the context of those two parables, that these parables are telling us that we have to wait on the Lord. A seed doesn't grow overnight. You don't just put it in the ground and then the next day there's this giant tree. That's not how it works. And leaven, you don't just put it in the dough and then all of a sudden it grows and you can just keep on with the bread making process. You have to let it, you cover it, you put it in a cool place, you let it rise, and then you can continue with the process. And that fits in with what we're taught about Christ's return. That we are to wait. We are to wait on his kingdom, and that we are to earnestly expect it. We're supposed to let the seed grow. We're supposed to let the leaven, leaven the whole lump of dough. And we are to wait for the kingdom of heaven. I think that sometimes there's a lot of debate over the kingdom of heaven. Is it the church? Is it something expectant? Personally, I kind of believe it's both. And if you want to talk to me about that later, we can. But I think that this is probably one of the underlying truth that Jesus is trying to communicate to his disciples, that when it comes to God's plan, we have to wait. That is our hope. That is what we expect. And you see that in the first century church, that they almost expected as if Christ was going to come back, the next day. He's coming soon. And I think to some degree there's a temptation for us to kind of not think about that, because it's been a couple thousand years. But the kingdom of heaven is to be waited for, and it is worth the wait. So looking at those three truths from these particular parables, that God is powerful, that his kingdom is one of love, and that we are to wait on him, how can we take those messages and turn them into something that's practical? Because that's what these parables are. They're truths that we want to take and use. And I think the first thing that we need to do with that is actually ask ourselves, what small ways can God change your life with his power? Because it's easy to overlook a seed, and it's easy to overlook leaven. And it can be easy to overlook how God wants us to change. It's a process that requires some pretty brutal and scathing honesty towards ourselves, and where we are personally and where we are spiritually, and how we are walking as Christians, and how we are expecting the kingdom. And I know it's a place where personally I fall short daily. Look in Matthew chapter 17 with me, if you will. When we're talking about mustard seeds, you kind of have to bring up this particular passage in Matthew. And it's an instance where, we'll be reading from verse 19 and 20, but it's an instance where Jesus' disciples fail to cast a demon out from a young boy. And the father, or I guess the father comes to Jesus and says, have mercy. He's been having these seizures his entire life. Can you cast it out? And Jesus does. He rebukes the demon, and it comes out of him. And starting in verse 19, it says, "Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, 'Why could we not cast it out?' And he said to them, 'Because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you.'" That is a wonderful statement. There's the obvious parallel here in terms of the parable of the mustard seed and Jesus referring to having the faith of a mustard seed. But when I read this, I can't help but compare myself to the disciples here. These were men who walked with Jesus. They followed him on a daily basis. They ate meals with him. They listened to his teachings. They saw the miraculous acts that he did. And Jesus is able to tell them that if you had faith like a grain of mustard seed, nothing would be impossible for you. I haven't seen those things. I don't think any of us have experienced what those men did. Yet, how do we measure up against a mustard seed in terms of faith? One of my favorite stories is kind of a parallel to this from Mark 9, where a father in a similar instance comes to Jesus and he asks to cast out this demon. And the way that he phrases it to Jesus is, if you can do anything, would you help me? And Jesus replies to him and says, "If you can, all things are possible for one who believes." And the father cries out, "I believe. Help my unbelief." And I have always related to that statement, "Help my unbelief." Because, how do we measure up against a mustard seed? If it's something that you can hold in the palm of your hand and will blow away with the wind, if you have faith that's that small, Jesus says that that's pretty much all you need. And, what I think is so great about this particular statement that the Father makes in Mark 9, where he says, "Help my unbelief," is that he sincerely believes that Jesus can help his unbelief. And that, I think, is sort of the answer here to this question that we're asking in order to, apply this mustard seed. What small way can God change your life with his power? He can give you the faith of a mustard seed. And that's a powerful application, because all of the power and all of the love and all of the expectancy that is wrapped up in these parables, God is able to give us that. We just have to ask him for it, and we have to pursue it and want it earnestly. And God can help us do that. He can allow faith to come to us in little ways, and he can allow change to take place in our lives in little ways that we might not even see. I don't even necessarily know all of the ways that God has acted in my life, but I believe that everything he has done has been for me to grow that mustard seed of faith and to hopefully move mountains. So let God help you with your unbelief. I believe that's our first point of application here. And the second one kind of ties in with everything in that we are to wait on the Lord. I want to close tonight in Psalm chapter 62. I know that's not typically the psalm that we go to when we think about waiting on God. We usually go to Psalm 27, verse 14, where it says, "Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage." But I want to read Psalm chapter 62, at least the last two verses. And I think that you will find that these verses sound oddly familiar in the context of what we're talking about tonight. Verse 11, "Once God has spoken, twice have I heard this, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love, for you will render to a man according to his work." I think if there was any way to sum up these two parables and what they mean and how we can use them in our lives, King David did it before the son of David ever walked the earth. Once God has spoken, twice have I heard this. The power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love, for you will render to a man according to his work. Those are beautiful and simple truths that Jesus has been teaching us again in our lives, and that I think are true manifestations of the kingdom of heaven and what we are to expect with God. So my encouragement to you to think about these things, contemplate them, read the passages again and again, and let God work to change you. And I think that you will see that these two small stories with their simple truths can impact you in ways that you never dreamed imagine. So let God change you tonight. And if there's any way that we can help you with that, we would love to as we sing.